In this video, we're talking about contrast ratio. This is one of the core concepts in my color grading practice, and for me, it really connects back to the photographic idea of contrast ratio, and that's an idea that I think we can all stand to be more aware of and to incorporate more into the way that we color grade our images. So that's what I want to focus on today. I'm going to show you inside of Resolve what I mean when I use the term contrast ratio, and then I'm going to show you how I use this concept to guide and to inform my practice when I'm color grading. Before we dive into Resolve, if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel yet, make sure you do. I put out 2 new videos every single week on color grading, and we also do a live session every Friday morning, Grade School, where you can bring in your questions on the subjects we've been exploring that week, and I will answer them live. So lots of cool stuff happening here on the channel that you don't want to miss. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you turn on your notifications. Let's take a look here inside of Resolve and talk about contrast ratio. So first things first, let's start with that photographic definition of contrast ratio that I referenced a moment ago. When we're talking about shooting something, we're talking about cinematography, we're talking about working on set, when we use the term contrast ratio, here's what we mean. We are referring to the ratio between the light reflecting off the key side of our subject versus the light reflecting off the fill side of our subject. And in the case of an image like this, you can see that I have what I would describe as a sort of moderate to high contrast ratio because there is a significant difference between this key side and this fill side over here, right? So that's kind of a moderate to high contrast ratio. And a great tell for assessing contrast ratio in terms of the initial image, when you're looking at a person's face, is to look at the nose. Because if you look at the shadow that is being cast by their nose, depending on how prominent and visible that shadow is, that's a pretty good predictor of how high or low your contrast ratio is. So you can look at the fill side in general, but you can also look at the shadow being cast by the nose to get a good sense of overall contrast ratio, okay? And that really leads to the first way that I like to use this idea of contrast ratio, the photographic idea of contrast ratio, when I am color grading. The way I use it is as an assessment tool. When I initially look at an image, I'm unconsciously assessing what the inherent contrast ratio of that scene of this image is. So if I look at image number 1 here, I've got, as I said, kind of a moderate to high contrast ratio. Image number 2, again, moderate to high contrast ratio. By the way, I haven't done any color grading today whatsoever, but what I have done is set up my overall color management. That's something that I always do, and I always do it the same way. If you need to brush up on that, we've got lots of great content here on the channel on that subject. In particular, DaVinci Wide Gamut Workflows, that series, will show you the exact color management settings that I'm using here today. And the other thing that I do have in place currently is I've got a look happening here at the timeline level of my node graph. This is from my Voyager LUT Pack. This is from the Essentials set of that LUT Pack. And as you can see, it's just giving me some creative character to my images before I even begin grading. So definitely something that I always incorporate when I'm color grading, some kind of an overall look. And the Voyager LUT Pack is a great way to do so if you're looking for a reliable set of tools that are going to give you some great looking creative foundations before you begin color grading. But back here on shot number 1 at the shot level, that's really the first thing that I'm using the photographic idea of contrast ratio for, is to assess what is my incoming contrast ratio. We've seen now here in shot 1 as well as 2 examples of more moderate to high contrast ratio. Let's look at shot number 4, and we can see in contrast that shot number 4 has a quite low contrast ratio, right? In this case, the key light is the sun. The sun is very soft. It's being diffused by all the clouds in the atmosphere here. And the distance between the key side, something up here like on our subject's forehead, and the fill side, like down here below her chin, that's not that much of a distance, right? That's a much lower ratio between those two areas than if she were being hit by direct hard sunlight, for example, right? So this is an example of a lower contrast ratio. Now, why does this matter? Why is it important? Well, it's a good thing to assess for a variety of reasons, but one thing that you can do with that assessment is apply the following rule of thumb. If you have a scene with a moderate to a high contrast ratio, generally you are going to want to take a more conservative approach with the contrast ratio that you introduce when you are color grading. If, on the other side of the spectrum, you have a scene with a lower contrast ratio, like this one, you may want or even need to introduce a higher contrast ratio when you're color grading, okay? So higher contrast ratio in camera, lower contrast ratio when you're color grading, lower contrast ratio in camera, higher contrast ratio when you're color grading, okay? That's not a one-size-fits-all prescription, and there's all points along that spectrum, but it is a useful rule of thumb, okay? And the other thing that we need to incorporate into our conversation about contrast ratio and the way that I use it when I'm actually color grading is another concept called exposure. Let's go over here to shot number 3 for a second so we can explore that piece of things. So here in shot number 3, I'm making that initial assessment already of like, okay, where's my contrast ratio at? Maybe starting to think about where I want to see it go. But there's something I need to address before I can even really begin looking at my contrast ratio and making adjustments there. And that's my exposure. That's why I have my exposure node in my template node graph here, very first thing up in my node tree, because that's where I want to start. And here's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about setting exposure. I'm still thinking about that contrast ratio in a sense, because what I'm going to look at when I set my exposure, which I'm going to do with my offset, is the key side of my subject's face. So I'm going to set this wheel in such a way that I'm really happy with the way that the surfaces being hit by the key light are rendering, okay? And if that means that my fill feels too dark or too heavy, that's okay, because I'm going to deal with that in a moment. So let's just look at this as an example. I'm going to say like, you know what? I really like all that texture that I'm getting here in my subject's forehead by dropping this exposure kind of low, kind of moody, okay? There's something about that that I really like, but when I look at the image now, it feels like the contrast ratio on the fill side here in particular is kind of heavy, right? Like I don't want to see things crash that hard into the floor and get that dark as I'm seeing currently. So this is where I can now go to my ratio node, and in the ratio node, this is where I'm adjusting my contrast ratio, and there's a million ways that you could do this, but I would look for the simplest tool that gets the job done. That's something that I talk about in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. Simple beats complex, okay? So in this case, in the ratio node, I could use something like my lift and my gain, or I could use my contrast pivot, which is my go-to preference here. So I'm just going to look at lowering my contrast ratio, and then also just kind of eyeballing and using my pivot to bias how much of the contrast I'm extracting or softening in the shadows versus in the highlights, okay? So I'm just gonna open this up and kind of bring it out into some sort of realm like this. And you can see that just by assessing, okay, where was my initial contrast ratio? It was kind of moderate, maybe leaning toward the high side. Where do I want to set the exposure specifically for my key light? Well, I'm gonna drop it down to about here. And now where do I want to set my contrast ratio in order to kind of like set the ratio around that key light? I'm using my contrast and my pivot to do that. So this is really a matter of assessing the original image and then determining where I want to see the image go. And let's just do a quick experiment for a second. I'm going to go to my gallery and I'm going to grab a still of this, and I'm going to reset my exposure and my ratio nodes and come up with a completely different recipe for the way I want to see this go. So in this case, I'm going to set my exposure, but I'm not going to set it in the same way I did before. I'm going to say I kind of like those soft blooming areas here on her forehead. So I'm going to leave the exposure much more open than I had a moment ago. And here on the ratio side, I'm going to say I actually would like to see a harder fill side of her face. I'd like to see more contrast. So I'm going to turn my contrast now over here to the right and set my pivot just kind of to taste. And if we wipe to the other version that we did a moment ago, totally different results, right? Totally different rendering of the image. And yet both were achieved quickly and with broad and clean tools. And both were rendered in a way or applied in a way that supports the original exposure, the original contrast ratio, as opposed to completely overlooking and ignoring what we were starting with, okay? So that's a very simple example of how we can just use these first two nodes in my template node graph to set exposure and contrast ratio using the same tools within those, but you can get very different results simply by changing your intent, changing where you set your exposure, and then changing what exactly you want to do to the image in your contrast ratio node in terms of the way that you are framing the other tones in the image around where you've set your key exposure, okay? So that's how I think about contrast ratio. That's how I manipulate it when I'm color grading. That's how I try to anchor my work back to what was done on set and maintain a photographic context for what I'm doing in the color grade. Contrast ratio, rather, is a big subject. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of different tools that we can use to manipulate it. So this is really just the tip of the iceberg, but it is a good introduction to how to think about contrast ratio in a more photographic sense, how to use that to better assess and to better set your base grade for your images when you are working with the idea just of contrast inside of DaVinci Resolve.